So I apologize for the blippy screen, and all I can say is look away if it's troubling you. Not quite sure where in the system that's happening. The other thing I wanted to do is check the volume. Is this about right in terms of the... Okay, great. I think you do have to hold it actually reasonably close to your face in order to get a good volume. All right, with those notes, it is my pleasure this evening to introduce Dr. S. Carly Kehoe. I didn't know there was an S. There you go. Dr. Kehoe is the Canada Research Chair in Atlantic Canada Communities at St. Mary's University. Carly's primary research areas are religion, migration, and minority identities in the British Atlantic. She's also interested in sustainable development and rural change, both in Nova Scotia and the Scottish Highlands. She and a Scottish colleague, I think, Chris Dalglish, edited a book series on the histories of the Scottish North Atlantic. It's published by the Edinburgh Press. Edinburgh University Press. And interestingly, she advocates on behalf of displaced and at-risk scholars. She is active as an editor and leader in scholarly associations. She's a member of the editorial boards of both the Scottish History Review and the Innis Review. And she's a fellow of Britain's Royal Historical Society. So, you know, almost as good as Royal Nova Scotia Historical Society. She's also president-elect of the Royal Society of Canada's College. I want to add here to the information that she has supplied us my thanks for her contribution to the Dalhousie panel on Lord Dalhousie and race and slavery. I was a member of that panel, and I think I can speak for us when I say that she wrote for us a working paper on Scotland and slavery that was very useful in the preparation of the report. And it's partly based on that I know we'll have a very expert talk tonight. Her talk title is Caribbean Slavery and the Scottish Diaspora in the Maritimes, and I'll hand the mic over to her now.
Is this volume okay for everybody? Can you hear me? Oh, it's nice to see the students here. Thanks for coming. But I do want to thank the Royal Nova Scotia Historical Society for the invitation to come and speak to you this evening. This is actually the first time I've given a public lecture on my research in the province. Most of the time I'm talking about this stuff in Scotland, so it's sort of nice to get, I'll be interested in your feedback. It's also a really good opportunity for me to get feedback from people who have a real awareness of what some of the settler communities were like here. I'm from Cape Breton, I'm from Marguerite Forks. And I'm interested in feedback because this is likely going to be my next book. It's sort of feeling like that at the moment, so I suspect that's what's going to happen. Much of my talk tonight actually is going to be about Scotland and what was happening there as a way of setting up how the connections were established, and also as a way of helping us to see how we might start to look at the source material differently. I was in Scotland for 16 years, so when I came home, one thing that I noticed is that there are a lot of statements made about Scotland that I think are a little bit incorrect. And I think that in order to understand how we're functioning here, and in a place like Cape Breton, where I come from, I think we need to go back a bit to Scotland and see what was going on there and their involvement in empire. And that's where a lot of this is going to come from. So, thank you for your attention. A big question that I set for myself that sits with me every day is, what did the Scottish Atlantic look like? And I would suggest to myself and others, it looks an awful lot different than the one I thought existed when I was growing up in Cape Breton. And that's an interesting thing. Sometimes it's a difficult thing, but it's also an important thing. Over the past decade or so, Scotland's links with Caribbean slavery and the triangular trade more broadly have been receiving increased attention from historians. Some of you might be aware of the big report that was issued by the University of Glasgow recently in terms of its links with that economy. Not only have we been active in locating previously unexplored archival material that's helping us to understand just how complex and varied Scottish participation in this economy was, as well as its involvement in the broader imperial program. But many of us are also looking at how the profits that Scots made in the Caribbean were reinvested back in Scotland. For starters, it influenced the rise of an extremely powerful Scottish merchant class. We feel that here. Also, its banking sector. It also fueled the growth of industry in places like Glasgow and Dundee. In my own work, when I was over there, I looked at how it enabled the expansion of something I've described as charitable enterprise, which was basically the establishment of hospitals, of asylums, and of schools in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. When I returned to Canada in 2016, I was equipped, I started this research in 2010, I was equipped with a fair amount of knowledge about how the Scots were involved in plantation slavery. But what I wasn't clear on was how all of this linked with the Scottish settlements that I knew of here. We can see this legacy of the Caribbean, we can see that it's a legacy that looms large in the Maritimes, but what I thought was murkier, because I would suggest that research has been limited, is what kind of shadow this activity casts on the activities of settling groups like the Scots. And I would argue the Irish. There's a lot of work that's being done right now on Irish participation in the plantation economy. I think people tend to dismiss it as an English enterprise. It absolutely was not. So I don't want us to get caught in a mistake there. What I'm exploring now is how the Caribbean money, which revolved around slavery, influenced the development of the Scottish diaspora here in our province. The carrying trade, we know, is a crucial component, and there's been really good work that's been done on this. Almost every small community depended on the ability of its farmers and fishers to sell their products to customers in the south or across the Atlantic in Europe. But beyond this, what were the connections and what is relevant to my talk tonight in terms of understanding this broader legacy? And also, if we're looking at this topic, where do we start? Because it's complicated and it can be intimidating as well. Looking at the presence of enslaved and formerly enslaved people here, I would suggest is a good place to start, and there have been people who have done that, and I'll mention them in a minute. But I think that I should flag that there are some really big differences between the Maritimes and Scotland that we need to understand. Slavery is absolutely practiced here. African people and people of African descent were enslaved here. Amani Whitfield has done extraordinary work on this that has helped to educate us all about this. He's one of many. But there wasn't a large absentee planter society present in the region. Scotland, by contrast, had a lot of absentee Caribbean planters. And if you go to the Scottish archives, any of them, and I'm talking about really small local community archives, municipal archives, or the national archives, they are awash with slave lists. And the reason why there are so many there is because the Scots, who were slave owners, wanted to register their property in the event of their death. That is a really big difference that I've noticed between what's available in the archival record in Scotland and what we've got here. If any of you know of examples that I'm not familiar with, please tell me. That will only help the research, which I think is what we all should be focused on. Many of you will also know that when compared to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, PEI stands out as an important anomaly because the laws governing slave ownership there was different. I think PEI actually holds the key to our understanding this, and I'm going to be moving in that direction. Not moving to PEI, but I'm quite happy here. But unlike Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, where slavery was given no formal recognition, it was here, but no formal recognition, slavery was enshrined in PEI by law with legislation such as an act declaring the baptism of slaves, that the baptism of slaves shall not exempt them from bondage, and that was passed in 1781. Given the way that PEI was governed, the colonial authorities tried to introduce a landlord-tenant system that was similar to what existed in Britain, and that a number of the Scottish landowners in PEI were coming from the very same families who had significant interests in the Caribbean and also in India. I think it's plausible to think that if there was an absentee planter population in the Maritimes, it was more likely to be there. And I think that that's a really important direction for the research to go in. If any of you know of students who would like to do this research as a master's student under me, please put them in touch. this is important stuff. And I'm going to dig deeper into this at the moment, but I would just like to say, in terms of what I've just said, my thoughts are preliminary. Not in terms of what I've said about Scotland, I know that stuff, but in terms of PEI, these are just ideas that are circulating in my brain. What I'm going to speak about tonight, though, concerns the connection between Caribbean money and Scottish settlement here. I spent a lot of time looking at the Western Highlands and Islands, largely because I'm an expert on Scottish Catholicism, and there were enormous pockets of Catholics that existed in the Western Highlands and Islands. And then from those areas, significant migration over to us here. But I stumbled upon a particular story that I am going to tell. I stumbled upon it by chance. It was one of those really amazing moments that changes the shape of your research or the course of what you're going to do, and they're brilliant. I love those. It happened to me once before as well. I was in Airsaig, not our Airsaig, Scottish Airsaig. And I was at a meeting of local community groups to talk about how university researchers and local community groups can work together to deal with difficult histories. And the difficult history that we were talking about was the involvement of the Western Highlanders with plantation slavery. And I noticed this really beautiful house, the white one over there. We went outside during one of the tea breaks, and I noticed that really beautiful house across the water, and I said, oh my gosh, that's so pretty. And they're like, oh, that's really important to what we're talking about here. That was Golden Sandy's house. He made a fortune in Jamaica. And so it was wonderful, and I had my camera, so I took a picture of it, and I kept this in the back of my mind, because also, not only had he made a fortune in Jamaica, he was Catholic. And so that was really, really important, because it's hard for us to trace Catholics in the Caribbean, just because they developed a culture of quiet isolation almost. And that's not the right word, but they were quiet because of the Reformation. Only when I came over here, though, and I picked up a book on the Glenaladale settlers in PEI in the Chesterfield Archives and Museum, which is in Port Hood in Cape Breton, did I start to put some of the pieces together. And it was one of those amazing afternoons where you just go down to the water and you sit and you're thinking, oh my goodness, this is a pretty fascinating connection. I wonder what's going on there. But before I get into the nuts and bolts of this talk, I want to explain a little bit about why this research is sensitive. Some of you will have a sense of this already. It's sensitive for a few reasons. We need to keep in mind that this research revolves around the fact that human beings were enslaved by Scots, and that Scots from all classes, all regions, and all religions were complicit in extending an economy revolving around the products produced by enslaved people, Africans and people of African descent. Often in Scotland there was this idea that it was only the elites who were involved in the plantation economy. But the research that's been coming out in the last few years is demonstrating beyond a doubt every single level of Scottish society was involved. It's also sensitive because it shines a light on darker elements of Scotland's colonial legacy, and some aspects of this work are uncomfortable for people who may find themselves attached to particular versions of the Scottish past. I say this as a Cape Breton, you know what I mean. Many parts of the Maritimes, where Scottishness has been appropriated as a kind of overarching identity, rightly or wrongly, this research jars with what most people know or want to know about the Scots. The Highlanders in particular, it's a very sensitive topic. And I'm only talking about Highlanders because that's my focus. This is not to suggest at all that they were the only ones involved. It was Lowlanders, it was all Scots. But it's also sensitive because it positions Highlanders as colonizers with significant privilege at a time when their home region was experiencing colonization through a process that we call Highland pacification. And this is basically the taming or improving of the Highlands and Islands through direct legislative intervention. This dichotomy can be really difficult to unpack, particularly when we consider the power of the clearance narrative. This narrative, the clearance narrative, is extremely important. The clearances happened. They happened in phases. They were different. This is a really important part of Scotland's past, but I need to stress that the evidence is irrefutable. Regardless of their reasons for leaving Scotland, Highlanders were colonizers and as invested in the colonial enterprise as every other European group. Not everybody likes to hear that, but it's a fact. So, I would like to talk now about how the Glenaladale settlement was involved with all of this. You'll be familiar with this map, I'm assuming, early map of what would become PEI. In April of 17, did that just get, no, it's the flashing. It's messing up my eyes too. In April of 1772, Alexander Curry and his wife Isabel Fitzgerald and their infant son Duncan left their home in South Uist, boarded a ship called the Alexander, and left Scotland forever. The family was bound for St. John's Island, what the British called PEI before it was renamed in 1799. And they were headed across the Atlantic, which was a daunting journey for anybody. Shipwrecks were still common, weather was bad, disease was rife, it was intimidating, and they were among the earlier big groups to go. Also making the journey with them were Angus and Margaret MacDonald of Kinloch Moydart and their 2 children, as well as Angus and Joanna MacDonald of Lochaber and their 6 children. The departure of these and many other families and individuals, I think they've counted about 210 or 211 in total, was a powerful statement about how the Northwest Highlands and Islands was failing them. Life in the post-Culloden Highlands was harsh. Clan chiefs were rapidly evolving into cash-hungry landlords. The English language was suffocating the ancient Gaelic, and a culture of anti-Catholicism was firmly embedded. Many regular people struggled to know where they were to fit in this new society, and many of those who could leave did, either migrating to other parts of the Highlands, to the coasts, or down to Glasgow, or quitting the country altogether. This is the region that I'm talking about where the majority of the people came from. And this is a fantastic resource that's provided by, it's the Scottish Statistical Accounts, and you can access it for free, and you can just click on any county and loads of information will come up from the 1790s and the 1840s. I used to be on the board. They do brilliant work, and it's free, and my students get to use it, so I like it. It also is a really pretty map. Concentrated Highland settlement in the Maritimes only began in the early 1770s, around the time that the Glenaladale settlers arrived on the northern shore of Prince Edward Island. Many of the Alexander's passengers were from Moydart and Arisaig, but almost half, almost 100, are thought to have come from South Uist, and this detail is particularly important, and I'll get to this in a few minutes. The plight of the South Uist people and the reason for their departure from Scotland is actually a catalyst for the entire settlement. But again, I'll say more about this in a few minutes. The story I'm going to tell tonight about the Glenaladale settlement in PEI doesn't actually start in 1772, when the migrants arrived in PEI. It actually started about 30 years earlier, in or just before 1745, on the eve of the third and final Jacobite rising, when one of the MacDonalds of Breordale, there are loads of MacDonalds, by the way, just to give you a heads up, and they often have the same names. Alexander MacDonald, son of Angus, left for Jamaica. Alexander's family were part of the Clan Ranald gentry, and he was one of 5 brothers, and we know for certain that 3 of them fought as Jacobites alongside Bonnie Prince Charlie, also known as Prince Charles Edward Stuart. While in Jamaica, Alexander acquired the nickname Golden Sandy, or Alistair Anor. I'm sure there are Gaelic speakers in the audience who can say it better than I can, but that was the Gaelic, on account of the vast wealth that he had acquired when he was there. I think the timing of the departure for Jamaica is curious. It makes me wonder what or who motivated him to go at that precise time. What we know is that following Culloden, many of the Jacobites who fled to the West Indies, or those who were convicted as criminals for having participated in the rising and sentenced to transportation, a lot of these Jacobites ended up in Jamaica. So a couple of questions, 3 questions in fact, that's come into mind. There are loads of questions in my brain, as I'm sure you're becoming aware. Was Alexander's migration to the Caribbean part of a broader strategy to shore up the family's fortunes? He was not the inheriting son. He was not the oldest son in the family. Was this family, through him, hoping to establish a foothold there to ensure its survival in the event of a failed Jacobite rising, which did turn out to be the case? Or was he just a young guy in search of adventure and fortune, which is absolutely plausible, completely plausible as well. But the timing of his departure does make me ask those questions. And families were aware that something was coming in the north in terms of a rising. And I'm just curious, were they hedging their bets? There's more research to be done on this. At this point, I'm not sure. But as we'll see, the wealth that he acquired there as a planter, we think a coffee planter, ensured that Clanranald lands stayed with preferred MacDonalds. Now, a really important historian who was a pioneer researcher on Scottish involvement in slavery is a guy named Doug Hamilton, and he works at the University of Hull. He did his PhD at the University of Aberdeen, but he now works at Hull. He makes a really, really important point about the Campbells of Argyll, and I know people here tend to see Campbells and MacDonalds as enemies, but they were Highlanders. And his point in relation to this particular family is really helpful for us in terms of understanding the utility of Caribbean connections to Highland society. He says, quote, "The development of an Argyll community in Western Jamaica demonstrates the successful operation of a network based on kinship and local association, and one that retained echoes of the very traditions that were under attack in Scotland. Basically, it means Highlanders from whatever family didn't stop acting like Highlanders just because they left the Highlands." And that's an important point. There are many, many people involved in the story that I'm telling, and one facet that I'm not including tonight, though I will absolutely, just because of the way I work, women were very, very important in keeping the settlement in PDI alive, particularly two relatives of the men I'm going to focus on. But the first person that I want to introduce to you as one of the main protagonists is Alexander, or Golden Sandy, who you know. The other, though, is his cousin, John MacDonald of Glenaladale, and he was the laird of two estates, Glenaladale and Glenfinnan. Their fathers were brothers and close allies, and they were part of the Clanranald gentry. I'm sure you'll be familiar with that scene. This is looking from the monument down the loch. It's one of the prettiest places in Scotland. I used to pass it regularly, and until I started doing this research, it didn't occur to me how important this landscape actually was. Both of these men came from staunch Jacobite stock, but of the two men, only John had title. Perhaps arrogant in his demeanor, I've heard him described as a few things, including being described as stolidly aristocratic. But it was on John's family's lands at Glenfinnan that the Jacobite standard was raised in 1745. What's of particular interest to me, because of my work on the British Catholic Atlantic, is the fact that John was a Catholic. And like the majority of the Scottish Catholic elite, he was sent to the continent for schooling because the education of Catholic children was forbidden in Britain under the penal laws. Interestingly, though, I was really interested to discover this. He wasn't sent to France, where so many children of the Jacobites were sent, and he also wasn't sent to Rome, where he would have had significant protection from the Jacobite community there. Instead, his parents sent him to Ratisbon Seminary in Regensburg, Germany. He was the inheriting son, and so his education was secular. He was not destined for the church. It is unlikely, though, that he completed his studies before he had to return to Scotland, because his father died early. In fact, his father died 2 years before John came into his majority, so he had to go home and kind of deal with everything there. I've said this a few times, but I want to say a few words about Catholicism in Scotland, because I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but it's a really, really important component to this story. Catholicism in Scotland had survived the 16th century Reformation, but only just. And it survived in three main parts of the country. The first was in the Northwest Highlands and Islands, which is the area that I'm focusing on here and talking to you about. The second was in the Northeast, Hampshire and Inverness, and Aberdeenshire. And then the third was in Kirkcudbrightshire down in the southwest. That's really the only places that Catholicism survived in Scotland. The widespread confiscation of Catholic estates following Culloden in 1746 with the Annexing Act and their subsequent sale to Protestant landlords was a devastating blow to what remained of elite Scottish Catholicism. And it left young men like John MacDonald to face a new socio-economic order, and it was a pretty scary prospect because they really didn't know what was going to happen, and they really didn't know what kind of authority they were going to have. The commissioners of the annexed estates, most of them came from the ranks of the barons of the Scottish Court of Exchequer, had initially tried to seize the Clanranald lands, but because the chief had not been a participant in the rising, this didn't end up happening, but they absolutely tried. The sons of the Clanranald chief, however, had participated and were in fact important supporters of Bonnie Prince Charlie. Both the Baroradale and the Glenaladale MacDonalds, Alexander and John's families, had in fact helped the prince escape after Culloden. Had authorities known this, I'm certain the land would have been taken and the punishments would have been severe and probably resulting in executions. But John was part of an upper tier of Highland society that was being increasingly squeezed out after mid-century. If he stayed in Scotland, there was almost nothing he could do to stop the erosion of his influence. And it's clear from his correspondence that he was growing increasingly frustrated with the limited opportunities. He wasn't used to this. He was used to coming from a family that had a lot of weight. And so to see that withdrawn was very, very difficult. And it was withdrawn in drips and drabs. A letter that I found in Scottish Catholic Archives from 1772 reveals a desire of his to move beyond Scotland to the colonies, where he could reestablish himself as a laird of the old style. So he didn't want society to change, he just wanted his power intact, and he expected to be able to do that in PEI. He did see the writing on the wall, but noted his regret at being, quote, obliged to give up his small but ancient footing in the kingdom. And this would have been a feeling that was shared by many people in the Highlands at this time. In 1770, he had been working kind of behind the scenes to purchase lot 36, and that was the circled part on the map of PEI that I showed you earlier. He bought that for £600 from Scotland's then Lord Advocate Sir James Montgomery. It's been suggested, and I think this is pretty plausible, that the sale was negotiated kind of behind the scenes by Scotland's most senior Catholic bishop, George Hay, partly because he was much respected. He had friends across the denominational spectrum, and he was based in Edinburgh. So he would have had the ear of people that he would have needed to speak to get his hat in the ring for this kind of land. It was in the interest of Catholic authorities to arrange something like this because the forfeiture of Catholic estates removed an important income stream for an already precarious church. Most of the new landlords were Protestant, and a number of them had started to threaten their Catholic tenants with eviction if they didn't convert to Presbyterianism. And this is exactly what happened in South Uist. There were rumors that were starting to emerge from the island in the late 1760s, early 1770s, that people were starving, they were losing their homes, and they were coming under extraordinary pressure to convert. John traveled to the island in 1771 to see for himself, and he confirmed, his letters confirm, that things were in fact as bad as they were being reported. Catholics in this particular region were vulnerable, and the trend of pressuring people to convert was really, really worrying to Scotland's two Catholic bishops, George Hay and John MacDonald, another John MacDonald. There are a few of them. And from that, for them, the breaking point actually came in 1771, when a guy by the name of Colin MacDonald inherited the lands in South Uist. He was a Presbyterian, and he threatened his Catholic tenants with eviction if they didn't convert. And so people were really scared, and they were really nervous, and they didn't really know what was going to happen. Not only did the bishops encourage his tenants and those on neighboring estates to emigrate, but they actually invested in Glenaladale's scheme to get people out of Scotland and over to PEI. In South Uist, the conditions of the poor tenants continued to deteriorate. And in 1773, according to the Bishop John MacDonald, one of his priests had traveled in the island and reported that he was absolutely exhausted on account of the great mortality among the people there. So starvation was a very real concern, and it was affecting the population. In one of his many letters to Bishop Hay, John MacDonald, this is Glenaladale, John MacDonald, not the bishop. It's confusing for me too, and I work with it every day. He wrote, they will be supported till they make a footing. Is there water? I'm so sorry. I'm just finding, I should have brought my water. Sorry, thanks, Sarah. So John MacDonald of Glenaladale wrote to Bishop Hay. Thank you. I'll see you again, maybe. This is why I like the Maritime. Share water. Maybe next time. He said that should have been this. It's very popular in this part of the Highlands. But in one of his many letters to Bishop A. John MacDonald of Glenaladale wrote, they will be supported till they make a footing the best way we can. True, it is destructive enough to me, considering the expense, but I will not have them think I am a bar in the way of their welfare, and it is making the best of all. What you're hearing there is the old traditional mentality of the laird, which is you take care of the people underneath you. They are your responsibility, and they will give you service in return, but you take care of them. Scottish Catholic authorities were deeply involved in supporting John to organize their removal, and with the help of other family members, namely his brother Donald and his sisters Helen and Margaret is the one, I think, who's the most important figure of all of them when it comes to them being in PEI. They all helped to get the people over. Now, one of a really important Canadian historian, J.M. Bumstead, he's explored aspects of the Glenaladale settlement, and he suggests, in fact, that the church covered a significant proportion of the costs. But what my research is revealing, I've spent an awful lot of time in archives over there, is that the support of the church was much more varied. And it was, I think, less about money and more about kind of support. And I noted this because Bishop Hay helped to negotiate the sale of the land in the first place. Hay also provided significant moral support to John when he's going through this transition. And if you read his letters, some of my students have read the letters, it's almost like the bishop is his therapist, because he's really struggling with what he's going through. It's an interesting eye on an 18th century figure. The church did cover bills that John couldn't pay. John was not good with money. I mean, that is really clear. And they acted as kind of a middle agent to smooth things over between John and his creditors when he got into trouble. And there were a lot of creditors, but this needs more research. But basically, John wanted to find a way to set himself up in PEI. And he was extremely naive, and he had grossly underestimated the cost of making a successful settlement, which included ensuring that the migrants had sufficient supplies to get them through the first year, and then be on their feet to support themselves. Within 7 months of his arrival, some of you will know this, John started to receive reports from them basically saying the crops had failed, people were hungry, the mice were raiding the stores, and morale was desperate. Even his younger brother, Donald, who was among the settlers, had said he was in a sad situation. And he was threatening to leave if John didn't hurry up and get out there and help them. And John confessed to Bishop Hay, if I got my land sold and some cash raised thereby, I would not despair. And this is where the Jamaican money comes in. And this is where the story changes. That he felt compelled to sell his lands to ensure the settlement's survival was, I would suggest, indicative of this deep responsibility that lairds felt to their people. And this was something that was being quickly eroded by the new style of land ownership that was spreading across the Highlands. New money landlords, a number of whom had acquired their wealth in the Caribbean, were buying up Highland estates at an alarming rate. And they were pushing out the existing tenants because many of them had no understanding of clan society, how it worked and what its obligations are. But also there were a number of returning Highlanders who were among the new landlords who wanted to see updates to the old ways or a new kind of economy emerge in the region altogether. And Golden Sandy was one of these people. He understood Highland ways, he was of that, but he'd been out of the country for a really, really long time. And when he came back, he wanted to show off the wealth that he had earned. And he wanted title. They were buying title. This is really, really important in terms of how Scottish society started to change. By February of 1773, John was absolutely desperate. His debts were mounting, and the drafts that he was sending were being refused. Basically, he's bouncing checks all over the place. One of his cousins, the Laird of Morar, he's also named John MacDonald, he reported to Bishop Hay that, quote, Glenaladale is still in this country and does not get his affairs settled so expeditiously as he would wish. He is now determined to sell off his estate and whatever else he has. This cousin also explained that he himself had been offered all of the stock that John had, and it was worth about £500, but he couldn't come up with the money, so he couldn't buy the animals. In spite of his desperation, though, this is where ties of kinship and loyalty are really, really important. In spite of his desperation, John was not about to sell the glens, and that's what he called the two estates, Glenfinnan and Glenaladale, to anybody. He was determined to keep them within certain sections of the family. Specifically, he wanted them to go to the allied family at Baroradale, who were also Catholic. And when the sale finally happened, they actually went to Golden Sandy, who was his first cousin, and that sale was negotiated by Golden Sandy's brothers, who were still in Scotland. It was a really tight-knit group, and it was about protecting the estates and keeping them with the right side. He also has brilliant penmanship, so it's a pleasure to read his writing. That's not always the case. John's take on the sale was this: I have sold the glens to my cousins in trust for their brother in preference to Clanranald. To prevent as much as possible the consequences of some fresh designs they, and it meant Voisdale and his pals, were said to be hatching against them in resentment to me. The fact that the two men, John and Golden Sandy, had probably never met didn't matter. Sandy left Scotland when John was just 3 years old. But the bond between the two families was secure and strong. Sorry, like, am I changing?
We're just trying to fix the flashing, sorry.
Okay. Sorry. It's important to emphasize, though, that the purchase was not a selfless act of kindness or generosity by Golden Sandy to get his cousin out of trouble. Sandy was part of the new moneyed elite, those Scots who had made their fortune in the Caribbean or increasingly in India. And often these men, they were usually men, we have some records of women, but they were usually men. They wanted to buy these estates to show off their wealth. Sandy's acquisition of the glens gave him land and influence, but it also gave him title. He became Alexander MacDonald of Glenaladale, and this was a big deal for somebody who had been on the make in Jamaica, came back and was the big man. Indeed, Sandy had become an extremely canny businessman during his time in the Caribbean, and this is clear from how he negotiated his payment agreement for the land. He said he was going to pay, it was a £3,000 sale price. He decided he was going to pay it in 2 installments. The first installment would be payable immediately for £1,000. The second installment would be paid £2,000 when a loan that he'd made to someone else matured and came in. So he was not just a planter, he was a money lender. So he really understood how to make a profit over there. And if you look, I have some really brilliant records with me. His will shows that he didn't just acquire this. Once he moved back to the Highlands, he started to acquire huge tracts of land all over the north. And so he was really invested in that region. Now, I'm still digging into the details of his wealth in Jamaica. Part of it was absolutely self-made, but we also know that part of it, maybe the majority of it, actually came from his first wife, who was a woman by the name of Mrs. Handyside, and she's really, really tricky to track down. I think she may have come from a family that was involved in colonial administration, but again, that's more speculation. That's not with evidence. This marriage produced no children. He had no heirs of this marriage. I actually think she'd been a widow, but she died before him, and the agreement that they had was that whoever died first, the other inherited everything. So he inherited everything, took the money, and went back to Scotland. What I'm curious but don't yet know is how many family members joined him or worked with him out there. What we do know is that the Scots were particularly clannish when it came to working abroad, and they gave themselves and their families and friends jobs. Maybe a little bit like Nova Scotia, if I can be so bold as to say something like that, as someone who grew up here and observed things quietly. But they looked after their own. And so I suspect that if I follow this closer in Jamaica, I'm going to find a lot of his family members who were set up with jobs by him there. I would like to know more about who his network included. Scots worked with other Scots, and that's important. And with whom did he trade? I'm really curious, was he involved in setting up any kind of carrying trade that connected with our part of the world up here once the settlements started going? Who were the merchants that he was dealing with? And another question I have, I don't think it's that important, but it's a more curiosity. Was it definitely a coffee plantation that he owned, or was he involved in cotton? And what else did he acquire in Jamaica? It is unusual if it was just one thing. We know for a fact in Scotland that he amassed an awful lot of additional holdings. I suspect he was doing the same thing before he came home. But in John's opinion, the cousin who sold him everything, the sale meant that the lands were turned over to what he described as the next best hands. Until the rest of the money was paid, though, John had promised himself that he was going to keep the first £1,000 and devote it only to the settlers in PEI because they were the ones that needed it. I'm sure you can guess that that didn't happen because when he ended up in Glasgow on his way over to PEI, he got caught by somebody he owed money to. So he had to pay all the money to the Glasgow merchant because that was supplies used. Those were supplies bought on credit to get the first group of settlers set up. It was a mess. There's a colleague of mine at Newcastle University, and she deals with Scottish elites and Irish elites, and they often did not get much training in financial management or prudence. So she describes a scaffold of debt, and I think that was how he was operating as well. But once the sale was concluded, he was on his way over to PEI. Like so many of Scotland's landed elites, John was forced to part with the Jamaica money before he even left. He didn't want to do that. And this was not a very good start. And again, this is where you see traces of support coming from the Catholic Church. While he was en route to PEI, he was in Boston. He had to write to Bishop Hay and say, look, can you pay the people here because I bought a bunch of supplies for the settlers and I don't have any money. By the way, see you later. And he also said, and I'm paraphrasing significantly, don't make me feel guilty about this because I had to sell my lands to support the Catholic Church in PEI. Yeah. So, what does all of this tell us? This is one story. What does all of this tell us about our own region, about Scotland's involvement in this economy? I think first and foremost, it tells us that the need to do more research in this area is urgent, and that's why I said, if you know students who want to work with me on this topic, please send them my way. But we know that profits from the plantation economy in the Caribbean, it did enable maritime settlement. I am sure this is the tip of the iceberg, and that's why I think PEI is so important to this story. I've highlighted one example, but there is more evidence surfacing all the time. This is a really wonderful ledger that I found at the Gestaco Museum and Archives in Port Hood. And it's a really humble ledger, and it shows what people were buying and what they were selling. And you can see that they're buying a lot of products that are coming from the Caribbean, and they're selling the stuff that they're making, and they're being sold by merchants going to the Caribbean. One thing I never thought of when I was growing up, nobody talked about this part of the history, is that every single small community required this trade in order to survive. So where would Cape Breton be, for example, if Judith, Port Hood, and Renesse Marguerite didn't have links to the trade that was going on with the Caribbean? I don't think they would be there. We also know that Scottish Catholicism was benefiting and in some ways surviving because of the connections with the Caribbean, both in terms of land and estate retention, but also in terms of mass immigrations and settler support. And I've done a lot of work on women religious. Scottish Catholics who were based in the Caribbean often sent their daughters back to Scotland to be educated in convent schools. That was a really important income stream. So all of these different things feed into this, what is becoming an intimidating and pretty big story. But I think it also tells us that the connections between the Maritimes and the Caribbean is a lot more complicated than we tend to assume. And when we start to trace migrations and we start to take a closer look at how the migrants, for example, who first went to PEI and then ended up in Cape Breton or mainland Nova Scotia survived, we can see that there was a huge level of dependence on the Caribbean. I think we need to do more to talk about this. I think it will be helpful. And the need for a more critical understanding of what the legacy of Scottish intervention in Britain's colonial enterprise was and how settler communities developed is really important, I think, for us to move society forward. Like I said, growing up, you didn't hear anything about this. People didn't really talk about it. I think they didn't really understand it or know about it. But there is a time, and I think it's now, when we start taking a more critical reflection on what we think or thought we knew about where we come from. And I think this is progressive thinking. And I think it's really useful if there's a willingness, a collective willingness, to do difficult, and some people would label it disruptive research, I would call it ethical, to develop a more critical understanding of the legacy of Highland colonial privilege. We cannot deny Highland colonial privilege. It's really complicated and it's messy, but it was absolutely there. And I think that starting to take a more proactive approach to this kind of research will actually empower communities and give people the opportunity to engage with their own difficult pasts. A colleague and I at St. Mary's, Alexander MacLeod, we've already started doing this. For the past, 4 years now, we have been using the amazing resource of the archives here, the Nova Scotia archives, the Cape Breton land petitions. And the students are looking at land petitions from their own communities to figure out, well, what don't we know about the people that we come from? What would we like to learn more about? And the fascinating thing about this group of kids in particular, this is in Nauvoo. A lot of the families that these kids come from are still on the original land of their families. So that it's really, really important to them. And we've had a great time working with those students. The other thing that I would mention is that all of this will lead to more research. And I just want to say, Mike Vance, who's a professor at St. Mary's with me, we have co-edited this book, and some of the stuff that I've talked about is in this. Reappraisals of British colonization in Atlantic Canada. It's not a typo, that's how they say colonization in the UK. But it's a really important opportunity for us to think about what research do we need to do, what do we need to do differently, and how can we provide a space for more diversity in the representation of groups that actually were here. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions. Oh, and I've just brought a couple of articles that I've written in case anybody would like to take them away.
I'll thank you properly at the end, but we'll help field questions if that's necessary. So questions or comments?
Yes, I have a couple of things. One, and this is sort of in the area of destructive history. Have you come across any research into the numbers of Scots Highlanders who were sold into slavery into the Caribbean?
No, because I don't subscribe to that belief at all. There's a big difference, and I'm sorry to come at you like this, but we deal with it all the time, and it's a big argument with the Irish too. There's this perception, and it's incorrect, that the Irish and the Scots were also slaves. There's a big difference between indentured servitude and chattel slavery.
I think you have to decide what is indentured servitude.
Oh, we've decided.
Um,
Yeah, it's a really,
I've done a lot of research.
yeah, so,
And other people
this
have.
is, I knew I was gonna get this question. I don't subscribe to that. I don't agree that the Irish and Scots were enslaved. If you want some really good writing on it, I would be delighted to sit down with you and share it with you to explain why this is problematic.
All right, just further comment on that, and then another question. You might look at Christopher Duffy, an American historian. She's done a lot of work in that issue as well. His is post-colonial, but there's also research on the 1600s as well. The other thing I wonder about is there was certainly a move post-colonial to move Highlanders into the British Army, and they spent a lot of time in Holland.
Yeah.
Have you done anything about how they got land grants in Nova Scotia?
I haven't done anything on it yet, but what we're finding with when we're doing a huge database of all of the petitions, the Cape Breton land petitions, and a lot of petitions were being made by soldiers.
And where is that?
Here, but you can sort of do searches online first, and it gives you sort of rough information, but then you can look at the documents, which look like that, and it'll often identify if they're military people. But the database that we're building will be open access. I just need more years, a couple more years to get it done with my students. But you can search, and it notes what regiment they were with. Yeah, so that there's a lot of stuff on there.
Especially from John McDonald's.
Gosh. Are any of our genealogists who can help me with the differences in terms of the John and the Alexander McDonald's?
A question from Jim Morrison.
Hi, Carly. Thank you very much. Enjoyed that. I know you're looking at the Caribbean, but I'm just wondering if you've come across very much evidence in terms of slaves who were taken back to Scotland by the lairds as a showpiece, or as they were in England as well.
Yeah, I've not done. I've read a lot about it, and
So it was done.
oh, really, it
Yeah.
really was done. The Joseph Knight case is probably the most famous in Scotland, and there's a brilliant book that's been written, and it's historical fiction, but it is pretty accurate, and it talks about that court case where he was a slave who was brought back by the Wedderburn families. They were just, I think, outside of Dundee, and he was baptized and therefore wanted to become free. That's actually what I think is also a really important link with Prince Edward Island. I think that act was passed in 1781 as a way to attract potential Scottish slave owners to say, your slaves aren't going to be made free if you come here with them. But there's an awful lot of evidence. If you go to any of the national galleries or museums, you're going to see paintings with enslaved people in them, belonging to the families. Yeah.
Are these all your graduate students?
These are the grade 12s from the Every Academy. Some of my graduate students are behind you. But Alex and I, because we come from there, we felt it was really important to build stronger links between university research and the high schools, and to help students see how you do research so that you can understand community development. And so we spent 2 years working in Terre Noire at Cape Breton Highlands, 2 years at Dalbrae, this is our second at Dalbrae, and then we'll go to Inverness 2 years after that, so we kind of share it out among the different high schools. But hopefully one of them will end up in a history master's program. I would be delighted. Yeah.
There's a question back there, and then you want to be next? Yeah.
I'm just curious about your thoughts on public history. I was just in the Highlands in October, and the story that I learned there was very much one of being colonized by the English and being forced to immigrate to the American and Canadian colonies, and there really was no discussion about the dichotomy between being both colonized and a colonizer, and this is a history that I've never encountered when I was there. Yeah. So I'm just curious about your experience in having these kind of discussions with Scottish folk, and how maybe they are grappling with changing or developing their public history.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, and I think it is something that the Highlands themselves are working with at the moment. I know the national curriculum for education in Scotland now includes a component on the slave trade, and the way that the curriculum is designed allows for local evidence to come into play so that kids can actually look at what happened in Invergordon or what happened in Dornoch or what happened in Inverness, so that they get a more local picture. I worked with a number of schools in the Highlands where we did that, and so for those students, that I wouldn't say that's public history, that's more public engagement. But what they did do was the students from Inverness Royal Academy, and in fact 25% of the startup money for Inverness Royal Academy in the 1790s came from Caribbean money. So they actually put on an exhibition at the Highland Archive Centre. And it was it's really helpful to work with high school students because they're quite open-minded and they're really curious and they ask questions that don't occur to us. So my experience comes largely from that. But there is a tension there, and that's why I flagged it as being really sensitive at the beginning, because we do have to recognize that the Highlands was undergoing a pretty brutal phase of colonization, and also in the early 19th century, that was when it was going to get really, really bad. But there's that sitting alongside of their own experience as colonizers. I think we just need to be a little bit more comfortable saying that it could be both. Yeah, but they're trying and they're treading lightly. The pioneer researcher in this is David Alston, and he, for many years, was by himself saying that there's a story here, it's uncomfortable, and he would get heckled and yelled at when he tried to say this in public. And then the universities started getting involved, and all of a sudden he wasn't alone anymore. And in fact, that article there, my colleague Chris Dalglish and I did, and it's talking about how historians can work with community groups to open up a past that is difficult, but it can't just be a historian from a university going into a community telling people how to think. It's how are we going to reframe this together? So they're doing really good work. It's taking time, but that's understandable. So you should take that. So don't take that, anyone, that's for her.
Before the next question, I'm just going to ask if it's okay if I turn off the overhead so that we can stop it.
I was going to ask that.
Okay. All right, and we have one question in the lineup and another one behind. Okay.
Actually, you can ask the other question. I was just to make a comment. I actually was in a group once, and one of the people there was called Wedderburn.
Oh, yes.
And so I asked him, I didn't know anything about Scottish history, so I've often wondered what happened to the Stuarts. And he said, actually, I'm a Stuart. Because, and his cousin is the Earl of Dundee now. So I was the first Scotsman I met I ever asked, and I hit right on the...
Yeah, the Wedderburns also benefited pretty enormously from the compensation when slavery was declared illegal in the British Empire. They got a lot of money from the government because they were major slave owners.
Really, yeah.
Yeah, there's a Legacies of British Slave Ownership project that was done by University College London, and it's a searchable database, so you can actually search names, and you can see the islands that people had enslaved people on. It's an amazing piece of work that they created, and it's really, really helpful. But the Wedderburn name sticks out as a pretty notorious.
Well, it wouldn't be a Highland name at all, though, would
No,
it?
I think it's on the East Coast. I think it's sort of above Edinburgh.
Yes, thank you. My relatives, my forefathers came from Lake Hewitt, and they were so poor when they arrived in Cape Breton that the rabbits come out of the woods to feed them carrots.
I love those rats.
Couldn't take the sheep with them. You mentioned about the clearances. Sorry. But you mentioned about the clearances. They arrived in French Road area, Cape Breton County, in the 1840s.
Okay.
I'll be very quick. And but you mentioned about the clearances. How long did that go on? And then secondly, you mentioned about Scottish being the essentially slave owners rather than being indentured or slaves.
They were indentured.
They were indentured. Sure, I drive here to that very point about, I think it was around after the Battle of Dunbar in the 1630s, a lot of Scottish laborers, you know, able-bodied men, were sold to John Winthrop and to the Saragus ironworks in Massachusetts for $10 or £10 each, and they were supposed to be paid. They never did get paid, but they were fed lots of beer, and then Saragus.
Beer or bear?
Beer.
Because it could have been
Beer.
either one. Okay.
No, like E-E-R.
Okay.
You know, Cape Breton is moonshine, but in Massachusetts it was beer. And they went bankrupt because the Scottish drank it out.
The old stereotypes are
story.
coming out.
You know,
Right,
I
right.
just wanted to know if that was anyways embodied in any of your research, because it does trail up to Cape Breton.
Okay, I can't speak about the 16th century in Massachusetts or the beer.
Okay.
But what I can say, the clearances, the kind of last bunch of them were about the 1850s. Yeah, and it seemed to happen in 3 phases. So you've got the first phase, late 18th, early 19th century. The second phase, 1810s, 1820s, when you get a lot of people coming into Sydney. Barra people were coming in. And then after that, there's a bit of a break, and then they start again in the 1840s and kind of they kind of end in the 1850s. And by that time, Canada wasn't Canada. I'm going to call it Canada. Wasn't the destination of choice anymore either. People were redirecting to Australia and New Zealand because it was tough, and there wasn't land here anymore. Any of the good land had been gone, and so what was the incentive? I mean, my grandfather was a fisherman from Almadam, and he talked about leaving fish on the doorstep of the Scots in the center of the island who didn't have a floor. They still had dirt, right? So that's not that long ago. I mean, I'm not denying the poverty, like there was significant poverty, particularly for the backland settlers. It was tough. I'm not surprised the rabbits.
Good story. We have many questions here and comments. So I've already heard from you, so I'll go to new people. Okay, so Afua.
Thank you, Carly. I found your presentation very fascinating. One, because I'm from the island of Jamaica, and as you rightly said, many people think that Jamaica was an English island. It actually was a Scottish island, actually more Scottish than Nova Scotia. Even the national flag, if you see the design of Jamaica's national flag, it has a cross of St. Andrew there in the middle, which was suggested by one of the Scottish colonial administrator as the island veered toward independence. So the point, what I wanted to say was that during the period of enslavement on the island, the principal enslavers were Scots, and the middle management people. And so in my own family, for example, so I know my last name is Cooper, which I know came from David and William Cooper, who came from Inverness in Scotland. I'm not saying I mixed with them. They owned the plantation where my patriline came from in Western Jamaica. And on my mother's side, it's all Scots names: Campbell, Drummond, Stuart, and on and on and on. So over 60% of the names on the island of Jamaica are Scottish last names. There are more Scottish place names on the island of Jamaica than in Nova Scotia. So we grew up, we use the word British, but we knew that it was the Scots who were the slave traders, the slave owners, the overseers on the plantations, and the men who actually impregnated slave women and gave them these last names. So it's a story that is known in Jamaica. It's not known in Nova Scotia so much, or even in Scotland. It's one of these hidden histories that have been kind of swept under the carpet. It's so easier to blame the English for everything, right?
Especially now.
Yeah.
Brexit. But no, you're absolutely right. And in archives, I found references to rape, to rape, regular rape. There was an enormous rape culture in the Caribbean. But in 2009, I think it was, Scotland had the year of homecoming, and a lot of people got frustrated with that because they weren't talking about all Scots or people of Scottish descent. They were talking about white people of Scottish descent. And people started to say, have you looked at Jamaica, and have you looked at a phone book? And why aren't you marketing, or why aren't you connecting with the Caribbean if you want to understand what Scottish descent includes? And so that was a real turning point, I think, in terms of the Scottish government actually acknowledging and kind of recognizing the need to rethink how they were doing things. But that was a wake-up call for a lot of people who hadn't thought about it before.
Yeah, because if I'm going homecoming, let's say to Scotland, it's not to celebrate Scottish identity. It's perhaps to ask for reparations. So it would be a different sort of homecoming, and people wouldn't like that, right?
Yeah. And it started at the University of Glasgow. I mean, it is my alma mater, but it has done a brilliant thing when it commissioned that report. And you talked about not just the owners of the plantations, but the middle levels as well. It had medical school, it had a law school, it trained people for the church. There was a direct route to the Caribbean. And there was a lot of money that came back to the university for that. And kudos to them for being brave enough to do that. The researcher he was the postdoc on it, but his name is Stephen Mullen. He's been outstanding in terms of opening this up and just the meticulous research and reviewing of archives. And I was just in Trinidad before Christmas. I was struck by the number of Scottish names on all the streets. It was disconcerting, and it was a surprise even for me, and I kind of expected it, but not to the extent that I saw it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, Phil I was just going to make a comment, but Phil kind of covered it. So just people are aware that the enslaved people were named after their enslavers, so it's always a bit of a shock to people coming from the continent to find all these black folk carrying Scottish names. It's not unusual to us, but you know, I think sometimes people forget that we were given names by enslaved folk. And so you were saying Wedderburn, and I know black Wedderburns that live in Halifax. And you know, Viola Desmond, who I did a lot of research, you know, both her grandparents were from Scotland.
It's a part of the story.
So I'm just saying, not only in the past, and there were relationships that were also forged between non-enslaved relationships, like in the case of Viola Desmond's family, which both on her father, Peter's, and I completely forget on her mother's side, Peter's, on her grandmother's side, Peter's, on the grandfather's side, I completely forget the name, great Scottish philosopher.
Hume?
I forget his name. It won't come to me. I'm getting old.
Russell?
but you know, they received the, you know, Russell. Yes.
Okay.
Bertrand Russell. So when, you know, she showed me the notice when the estate was being divvied up, and they got a notice, and one of their descendants, you know, ran off. So I said they were both relationships that were not based on enslavement, but in terms of, you know, just in terms of people falling in love.
Yeah.
So, and as you go through history, you see all these different permutations. So, but I think people forget that our names were all given to us. We're the only people in the world that don't carry our original ancestral names. So you have, you know, you can't trace Dave Woods through Africa. You have to start off with who at some point owned a member of my family, or enslaved a member.
One thing that links with your point, love was part of it.
Yeah.
In some respects. And what we found in Scotland and Scottish records is if there was if a Scottish man married woman and they moved back to Scotland and he died first, often there was no way his family was going to let her benefit or inherit. And there are a number of court cases where the family challenges and often she loses, and she shouldn't, right? But Scots law was there to protect Scots. And there's a lot of records of that. And so and then the children of those marriages often are sent to, be schooled in prestigious places, but they're not treated that way. I mean, it's a really difficult thing to navigate. And those evidence of that pops up again and again and again in the archives.
I just have to jump in here quickly on marriage rights. There's an important Canadian case on country marriages, that is white fur traders marrying Indigenous women in the West. And there was a very big estate that was settled in the 1860s where it was kind of precedent setting because the country wife and her descendants inherited through that. I was wondering if the situation you're describing precedes the 1860s? Yeah, okay, because I would be curious to see whether there's a transformation, because it was highly contested for all the reasons that you described. Okay, that's one of those comments, not questions. Just wanted to add something. David?
Yeah, I was wondering, have you connected some of these families of DEI with the families in South and North Carolina, 76, etc., because a lot of Scottish slave owners come from Scotland. They're involved in 76 district before they come up to Nova Scotia mentioned DEI. And I would imagine that some of the same people are connected with with John McDonald and others in DEI. The other thing was Clan Ranald, is it?
Clan Ranald, yeah.
Is the McKinnon clan part of that?
I have a map in my office beside my desk with all the names.
Something that
I'll get back to you.
Ranald McKinnon and all that is somehow connected with that.
I don't know all the names, but where they were, but thank you very much for your point about the Carolinas. That's kind of the stuff that I need to know about.
Yes.
Yes, no, I was just going to say, because with the restoration colonies, of course, you begin having American colonies which are established in the presence of Catholicism on the throne. So it's a very different kind of motion, and more empowered kind of motion. And these are, of course, people who are frequently slave owners as well. But and the comment on the country marriages and so on, this has gone on very late. The issue of education as the product of money is so really interesting. Because even, here we have got, the rate on Castine, which, what do you do with the money? You establish a library and a university, or a college, as the case may be. And, the educating of other people is a very important thing. Again, this is a way of transferring capital, because I know as recently as the 20th century, the late 19th century, in my own family, in Bermuda, there are people who, there would be a marriage, or not a marriage, but there would be a long-standing relationship between a white person and a black woman. This is not slavery. And what would happen, the children would be illegitimate, but they would be exceedingly well educated, and of course that now gone on to populate, the upper echelons of Bermuda government and society. So even if you can't bestow a title, what you would do is bestow an education. At the same token of money, one of the things you would do at that point is buy an education. These people coming back to the Highlands with money, what do? They buy a title, they buy something, they buy an intangible, and that's what they really want towards.
Yeah, when I was working with the students at Inverness Royal Academy, the amazing thing about the academy is that in a metal locker in the janitor's room, all of the 18th century books related to the establishment were there. And so we brought them out and the students were looking at it, and you could see the list of the students who were enrolled in the 1790s and early 19th century and where they were born. And what one student said, he's like, wait a minute, the school in the 1790s was more diverse than it is right now, because it listed all the islands that the kids had come from. So you've got loads, of course, from the Highlands, but you also had a lot of kids from islands in the Caribbean whose fathers sent them home to be educated. And that was a really amazing observation by that student that has obviously stuck with me because I'm now sharing it with you.
But they were not necessarily white.
No, they were mixed race children.
I've been really impressed in England that the municipal archives are hand in hand and in the same building with the family history groups. It seems to be very common. I don't know whether it is in Scotland. Here we have a sea of people that are doing genealogy on their Scottish roots. They don't have a home, and we have a municipal archives that is a bin in Burnside. And
my student has struggled with that archive. He feels pain.
I would love to see this society get behind the idea and really politicize our council, that not tear down the memorial library, but rather extend it over the hundreds of graves that are there to be our municipal archives and family history center. At the other end of the scale, I wondered whether the DeBar papers from PEI are any use to the kind of research you're doing, or is he way up here somewhere and you want data down here?
I want data. So I will look into that and let you know. I don't know, I'm not familiar with those papers. I haven't looked at them.
They may be worth at least looking at the indexes, and they've been, I think, well indexed.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
I think we'll make this the last question, and then people can
You had
mill
a
about
question
it.
as well.
Oh, it's this gentleman there that I was.
Oh, I thought you were pointing to the...
Nope.
Oh.
Oh, sorry. Oh my God, I did. It's true. Okay, two more, and then that's it. I'm sorry, I missed you. Go ahead.
First of all, it's very interesting in your relationship with the Scottish Diaspora and the Caribbean trade. So I've done some research on the Irish mercantile connection of Halifax for the early 1800s and the Caribbean with the Culloden family. So I was looking at those parallels. So I was interested when you mentioned not just the Scots, but also the Irish. Need further investigation. I know that Terry Murphy is doing work in that area, and so it's interesting in that comparison, as well as Peter Ludlow, also looking at the Irish and Caribbean connection. The second part is looking at, beyond everything I'm saying, with your work, the underlying methodology you might describe as the settler state paradigm. I know it's because your broad comment that all Scots, regardless of economic class and so on, were complicit. So I understand that's where your methodology is going. Have you yourself critiqued the settler state paradigm, not only areas where it's a contribution to historiographical research, also potential flaws, nuances, and problems, and where it might be improved? Because I've been doing a fair amount of research on this side, and I see there are inherent problems with it because of the broadcast, the underlying statements that reason you have two paradigms, oppressor, oppressed, dispossessor, dispossessed, without looking at areas of grayness and nuance. So I'm wondering how, if you yourself have actually critiqued and analyze that paradigm before you employ it with your own historiographical research and writing.
So it wasn't clear to you that I said that it could be both?
Well,
because I did.
I know you said that,
and it's.
But I'm asking, have you critiqued the settler state paradigm itself?
I didn't look at it from the perspective of the settler state paradigm as you're describing it. And when I say all Scots are complicit, obviously I don't mean every single Scot, because there was a very strong abolition movement in Scotland, and it was present in all the different places. But I would never categorize myself as a historian that says it's always one thing and never the other. If anything, it's extremely messy. So I think I'm doing, I mean, it's my job to do what I'm doing.
Again, that's something.
History, so I have written in those areas and am exploring further. So I was interested in your underlying interpretations, how you're bringing that to rest of issues.
Okay.
That does sound like something that could be discussed in the afterwards.
I'm still looking for other historians who critique it seriously. Because used to be said, if you have two Jesuits, you have three opinions. I expect with two historians, there are three or more opinions.
Oh, historians are notorious for not doing
But I'm still looking for historians that actually critique.
I would suggest, in my role, I critique everything I do because it's my professional responsibility. There we go.
Okay, something that might go on during the break, but is there a question from the speaker more than a comment?
No, actually I'll have one comment. I really enjoyed your lecture and I look forward to your
Thanks very
Yay.
much. Thanks.
Thank
And
you
if
so
you have
much.
feedback, please tell me.